Just going to get my bottle of
Welcome
milk.
back to the daily Rambam class. We are up to chapter 4 of the laws of entering into the base of Hamikdash. It is Thursday. Let us begin with our customary overview of where we are up to in the Rambam. Let me share my screen. We are learning the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, which has 14 volumes. We are up to volume number 8, which is called Sefer Avodah, the book of service, the temple service, and has 9 topics and 95 chapters. We are more than halfway through the books of the Rambam. Let's take a look at Sefer Avodah, the book of temple service. So these are the 9 topics that we are covering. We've learned about the Beis HaBechira, the temple, the Beis Hamikdash, 8 chapters on that. We learned about the vessels, the utensils of the temple, 10 chapters on that. And now we are learning about entering the temple, 9 chapters on that. We're up to chapter 4, which means by next week, we will be on to the next section. Next Thursday, we'll be on to the next section of Yisurim Mizbeach, forbidden offerings. We'll learn about bringing offerings, the daily and added offerings, things that are disqualified in the Beis Hamikdash, and the service of Yom Kippur, and finally sacrilege if a person was to use holy items for personal use. Those are the 9 topics of the book of Avodah. And after that, we move on to the book of Korbanos, which I think deal with people's private offerings that they would bring, and please God will bring when Mashiach comes very soon. But for today, as we said, we are in the 3rd topic of Beis Hamikdash, entering the temple. We are up to chapter number 4. The first 3 chapters that you learned about over the last 3 days spoke about forbidden entry. And the next 2 chapters, today and tomorrow, will speak about the purification of the Kohen. I don't know if those classifications are exactly accurate, because today's chapter doesn't speak much about the purification of the Kohen. It speaks predominantly about impurity and the ramifications. So this might need to be revised. So this is for today. We're up to chapter 4. This title, Temple Officers, is incorrect. I need to update that. But we'll be learning about an impure Kohen that is forbidden to serve, unknown impurity and the power of the tzitz, and finally, Korbanos with fixed times. Let's take a look at today's chapter, chapter 4. Let me share that on the screen. When an impure person serves in the temple, he desecrates his service and is liable for death at the hand of heaven for performing the service, even if he didn't hang out there, if he didn't delay being there. Because we'll learn that there's 2 separate negative commands, there's 2 separate sins. There's one sin of having service in the Beis Hamikdash, and there's another sin of being present in the Beis Hamikdash when in a state of impurity, which, by the way, is why we are not allowed to go onto certain places of the Temple Mount, even today, in the 21st century. At times when the Temple Mount has been opened, there are areas that one may not go because they are holy, and one is not allowed to be there unless they have been purified, for which one would need the sprinkling of the red heifer. Some avoid going on the Temple Mount altogether out of lack of clarity of which area exactly is which. This is a very holy space. So we say even if a person didn't spend time there, but they did a service, they did a service while they were impure, then they are liable for death in the hands of heaven. As we see in the pasuk, so that they draw back for the sanctified objects of the children of Israel and not desecrate my holy name. This is a warning for a person who serves while ritually impure. Further on, the Torah says they will die because of it, because they desecrated it. Just as in the latter instance, we're talking about death in the hands of heaven, So too with regards to service that's done in a state of impurity, one is also liable for death in the hands of heaven, meaning that the Beis Din, the court, wouldn't put him to death, but he would be liable of death in the hands of heaven. He would be given by the Beis Din lashes, as would be the case of anybody who is liable for death in the hands of heaven. Now, although one who serves in a state of impurity is liable for lashes in courts, this is going to be a tough one to explain. In fact, I won't be able to explain it, but it is what it is. His priestly brethren would not bring him to the court. Instead, they would take him outside the temple and split open his brain, and they would not be rebuked for this. Sorry, guys, I don't have an explanation. Maybe you'll ask some of the other rabbis, those that are more educated than me. I hope that there is some explanation on this, but I'm as bothered by it as I think you are. But nonetheless, that's what would happen. That's how severe. Now, what they did, I don't know how to explain that, but it does indicate how severe of a sin it was for somebody to serve while in a state of impurity. Sorry. Okay. Now, moving on, how is it possible for a priest to perform service without carrying that he'd be liable only for death and not kares? Because there's two separate punishments. There's one punishment for somebody who hangs out in the temple, who spends time in the temple while impure. There's another punishment for somebody who does service. So how could a person be service without being there? He gives an example. So he became impure while he was in the courtyard in the temple, and he left in the fastest way possible. But as he was leaving, he used a cylinder in his hands, some kind of tongues or something, to turn over a limb for a sacrifice on the fire of the altar. So on his way out, he just stretched out his hand and quickly tossed the limb over, which was part of the service. So he's left in the fastest way possible, but in the process, he's also done a service. Since he also did a service, even though he didn't delay being there, although he did a service, since he did a service while in a state of impurity, so that's when he would be liable only in the hands of heaven and not kares. Okay. And why is that considered a service? Because any contribution to the temple service, meaning any part he plays in temple service, is considered equivalent as if he did that whole service. It's as if he brought that whole animal on the mizbeach, on the altar, even though all he did was he tossed over one of its limbs. Similarly, if one who was impure immersed in the mikveh, and then perform service before nightfall. So in order for a kohen to be able to serve, he needs three things. He needs to go to mikveh, he needs to wait till sunset, and he needs to bring a korban. If he went to mikveh, but he didn't wait till nightfall before he started serving, then his service is invalid and he is liable for death in the hands of heaven. As the Torah says, they shall not desecrate the name of their God. According to the oral tradition, we learned that this is a warning to a person who was impure, but he immersed himself that day, he performed service in the temple, for he is still impure, but he's already gone to mikveh. And the sun sets and he will become pure. Implied is that until then, he was not pure. A person whose atonement process was not completed, meaning he hadn't yet brought an offering, he hadn't done stage 3, he's done step 1, he went to mikveh, and step 2, he also waited till sunset. But he didn't bring the offering yet, and he performed service, so he would be exempt from punishment, even though the service is still invalid and is desecrated. So if you brought an offering, the offering would be invalid, but he wouldn't be liable for punishment since he's already both gone to mikveh and waited until sunset. He just hasn't yet brought his offering of purification. What is the source that teaches that such service is impure? With regards to a woman impure due to childbirth, the Torah says, and the priest shall atone for her and she shall become pure. Implied is that until now she wasn't pure. So that teaches us that the third step, an offering needs to be brought as well. When Mashiach comes, that third offering will be brought. The same applies to anybody whose atonement is incomplete. So hopefully when Mashiach comes, please God, today, you'll all be super clued up with these laws. You'll be advising the rest of South African jury exactly how to go about things. Okay, now here's an interesting scenario. The next 3 halachos, 6, 7, and 8, speak about where he didn't realize that he had become impure. Okay, so he performed his service, and then it becomes known that he was impure. So it depends on how he had become impure. If the source of impurity was known, so we're going to speak about a source of impurity that's known, even if it's just to one person, or a source of impurity that's not known to anybody. So if it was a source of impurity that was known, for example, somebody was killed on the way and he had touched that person, so obviously the murderer knew about this person being killed, so that's a known source of impurity. So then, although the Kohen wasn't aware that he had touched this dead person, since he did, so unfortunately all of the sacrifices that he offered are invalid, or his work is defiled. So I guess what this helps us understand is that purity and impurity is not just like a to be impure or pure is not just like an adjective. It's an actual abstract noun. It's an entity. It's a real thing, even though he didn't even know he was impure. And he was a kohen and he was working in the Beis Hamikdash. The fact that he was impure means that whatever he did was disqualified. Thinking in modern terms, maybe it's not such a good example, but I know that when dealing with certain types of equipment, electronic equipment, there's a concern of static electricity causing damage. So certain equipment needs to be handled in a static-free room. So if a guy was busy fixing this computer chip, and he had no idea that he had static electricity on him, and he went about it and he fixed the whole computer chip. He spent a few hours working on it. So if he has that static electricity that's damaging, although he had no knowledge of it, when you put that chip back into the computer's not going to work. Because in order for that, whatever he did to be effective, he needs to be in a state of static electricity purity. That's just an analogy. The same goes spiritually speaking. If a person is impure, even if they're not aware of it, whether they like it or not, it causes that whatever they've done in a state of impurity is different, is not the same. Which is why mikveh is something that's so important. So even if he didn't know, everything that all the service that he's done is ineffective, invalid. If, however, he became pure due to the impurity likened to the depths, it's called tumas hatahoy, the death of the depths, where actually no one person even knew that there was a dead person there. The different analogies that's given, it could be where it's like, I spoke about it earlier in the Rambam, it could be in a cave that has water where somebody drowned and nobody knew that he was there. And he went to mikveh, or he went for a swim and he didn't realize that he had come in contact with a dead corpse. So if it's a impurity that nobody, not even one person, knew about it, and he didn't know about it either, so then we say that the tzitz, which is one of the 8 garments of the high priest, the forehead plate, brings appeasement, and all the sacrifices he offered are accepted. So this is a special concept, which is that if it's a tumas hatahoy, if the impurity was from the depths that nobody knew about it on planet Earth, then somehow that will not defile his service. Why not? Because the tzitz, the forehead plate of the Kohen Gadol atones for it. So if we wanted to give modern examples, I guess if there was a specific type of static electricity where somehow some kind of device in the room is able to overdo that, to cause that it doesn't cause problems. So similarly, if there's a specific type of impurity, so the tzitz of the Kohen Gadol, the forehead plate is able to bring atonement, and his offerings are acceptable. Even if he became aware of the fact that he was impure before the blood was sprinkled on the altar, and then he sprinkled the blood, it still brings appeasement. For the forehead plate brings about appeasement for the impurity, likened to the depths, even though he transgresses intentionally. We already explained impurity likened to the depths in Hilchos Nazirus when speaking about the Nazir. That's where you'll find more about this hidden impurity that nobody knew anything about. Similarly, the forehead plate brings atonement if the objects being sacrificed, if the objects are impure. So the kohen is pure, but the objects are impure. as the Torah says, and it shall be on the forehead of Aaron, and Aaron will bear the sins of the sacred objects. Does not, however, bring about appeasement if the portions of the sacrifice that are eaten are impure, or if the one offering the sacrifice is impure, when he became impure because of a known source of impurity, unless the impurity was superseded by a communal obligation, in which instance the forehead plate generates appeasement for it. So in summary, if the kohen was pure, but the item was impure, then also the tzitz will help, just like it would help if the kohen was impure from an impurity that was not known to anybody. However, it will not help if it was food that people would be eating. So certain offerings were eaten, and certain offerings were not eaten. So if it was an offering that is eaten, then the tzitz, the forehead plate, will not bring appeasement. The forehead plate does not bring about appeasement unless it is on the high priest's forehead, as the verse above continues, and it will be on his forehead at all times for appeasement before Hashem. So only if the Kohen Gadol was actually wearing the plate would it be effective in bringing appeasement. The other thing we mentioned in Halacha 7 is if it was something where there was a communal obligation that superseded the impurity. Let's hear more about that over the next 10 halachas. So any sacrifice that does not have a set time, it doesn't have to be brought on a particular date. Any such sacrifice does not supersede Shabbos or impurity. Meaning, why not? Because you don't have to bring it today. If you don't bring it today, you can bring it tomorrow or the day after. So therefore, why break Shabbos to bring it? But any offering that does have a set time, whether it be a communal offering or an individual offering where it has to be brought on a specific day. I guess an example of an individual offering that has to be brought on a set day would be the Paschal offering, the Korban Pesach, because that's an offering that's placed on the individual, but it has a specific time. So any offering that has to be brought on a specific date supersedes Shabbos and ritual impurity. So for example, when we say Musaf on Shabbos, it's corresponding to an offering that was brought on Shabbos. So they would be breaking Shabbos to bring that offering. Why? Because that offering has a specific time, which is to be brought on Shabbos. So Hashem is saying that in this instance, this overrides Shabbos. It would also override ritual impurity. It does not supersede all types of ritual impurity, however, only those stemming from contact with a dead body. All of the communal sacrifices have a fixed time when they must be offered. Hence, offering, so any communal sacrifice has a fixed time. Therefore, they supersede Shabbos and impurity coming from a dead body. All of the sacrifices that were brought to the state of impurity, so although they must be brought, but they cannot be eaten. Instead, the elements of the sacrifice that are fit to be consumed by fire are offered on the altar, and the remaining portions that would usually be eaten are burnt in the same manner as are other sacrifices that became impure, which is that they take them to the outside of the temple, and they would burn them there. So what do we mean by saying that it supersedes the laws of impurity? So how does it work? This is how it works. If the time when that sacrifice is meant to be offered arrives, and the majority of the people offering it were impure due to contact with a human corpse. So for example, if Pesach was coming and everybody has a mitzvah to bring a Korban Pesach, but majority of the Jewish people were impure, or the people at large were pure, but the priests offering it were impure due to contact with the human corpse, or both of these were pure, but the temple utensils were impure due to contact with the human corpse. So in all these instances, whether it is the people, majority of the people that are impure, or the Koyanim, or the Beis Hamikdash's utensils, in all these three scenarios, the sacrifice should be offered in a state of impurity. Both the impure and pure should be involved in this offering together and enter into the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash. Those who are impure because of other reasons, Zavim and Zavos, women in their menstrual state, those after childbirth, those who came in contact with the corpse of animals or large animals, teeming animals or large animals or the like, should not be involved and should not enter the courtyard. In other words, this license to bring offering in a state of impurity is only granted for impurity that comes from contact with the dead body, no other source of impurity. Even though sacrifices are being offered in a state of impurity, it's only one type of impurity that is allowed. If they transgressed and took part, people that had other sources of impurity, and they took part in the sacrifice or entered the temple, they are liable for kores, for entering the courtyard, or death in the hands of heaven. For carrying out the service, because as we said earlier, anybody who's impure who brings an offering is liable for death in the hands of heaven. There are no exception. Even though the others are also impure, since they're impure due to a human corpse, where license is given, if majority of people were impure, they can. People that are impure for other reasons cannot. But only the impurity stemming from contact with the human corpse was superseded. When a paschal sacrifice is offered in the state of impurity, and those who were impure due to contact with the human corpse pressed on and entered the sanctuary, they are exempt even though they were only permitted to enter the courtyard. So if they enter the actual sanctuary, which is beyond where their license was given, they wouldn't be punished. Since the Torah says, send them beyond the camp. So that does not apply to them, and therefore they are exempt, because they were allowed to enter since the majority of Israel were impure. If a portion of the priests of the clan scheduled to serve in the temple that day were impure, and a portion of them were pure, even if the majority were impure due to contact with the human corpse, only those who are pure should offer the sacrifice. So now it's not a majority of the Jewish people, it's just a majority of people that were scheduled to serve that day. So then we say that no, only those that are pure should serve. If all the priests of that clan were impure, so then bring in another clan. If all the priests of that watch were impure, so that's larger, you have individual clans for each day, then you have a watch that covers an entire week. So if all the clans of that watch were impure due to contact with the human corpse, then we look for another watch, another week, another team. If most of the priests who entered Jerusalem at a given time were impure, then it would be offered in impurities. If it's already majority of all priests, regardless of any clan, then at that point we say that the offering should still be brought even though they're impure. When do we search for a priest who is pure from another clan? Why do we search for a priest who is pure from another clan? Because the prohibition against serving while impure was not released entirely in order to offer the communal sacrifices. Instead, the prohibition is still standing. It is merely superseded temporarily because of the pressing situation. We do not override any prohibitions that may be superseded, except in a situation where there's no alternative. For this reason, the forehead plate is required to bring about appeasements. In summary, what I was saying was, if we're saying that if majority of the Kohanim are impure, then they could bring it in impurity. So if this guy is waiting all year for his day, and today is his day, he's been waiting for the last 11 and a half months, and he's impure. So we're asking if it could work for majority of Kohanim being pure, why can't it work for him too? We answer very simply. This that we allow a Kohen who's impure to bring an offering is only when there's no alternative. Here there is an alternative. And therefore, unfortunately, he would lose his chance to somebody who is still pure. What is a source that teaches that the prohibition against ritual impurity, are superseded to bring communal offerings? How do we know that communal offerings take priority over ritual impurity? Maybe they just shouldn't bring the offerings. Maybe there should be no paschal offering. The Torah says, men who are impure because of a deceased human soul, according to the oral tradition. What does it mean? Particular individuals are deferred to Pesach Sheni if they were impure, because it's men, it's individuals. If, however, the community at large is impure, then the offering is not deferred. It would still be brought. If the impurity was from being in contact with a dead body. Instead, the prohibition against ritual impurity is superseded, and the paschal sacrifice should be offered in a state of impurity. The same applies to every sacrifice that has a fixed time, like the paschal offering. The obligation to offer it supersedes the prohibition against ritual impurity. This concept is explicitly stated in the Torah, or I should say in Tanakh, as it says, for a multitude of the congregation. So it's inferred in the 5 books of Moses, and it's mentioned explicitly in Chronicles, Divrei Hayamim, as follows. And we quote, for a multitude of the congregation had not sanctified themselves, and the Levites presided over the slaughter of the paschal sacrifice for all who were not pure. So here we see clearly that it was brought for people that were impure. But many of the people, many from Ephraim, Manasseh, Yisachar, and Zebulun had not purified themselves. What that is meant by the statement, what's meant by the statement, they partook of the paschal sacrifice not in accordance with what was written, because they made that year a leap year because of ritual impurity. So they thought, since everybody's impure, let's add another Adar, and that we will have an extra month. Then people will become pure. As we see, and the king, his officers, and all the congregation in Jerusalem had conferred and decided to offer the Pesach in the second month, because they were not able to offer it at its time because there were not enough priests who had sanctified themselves. As we explained already in Hilchos Kiddush HaChodesh, and as initial preference, we did not declare leap year because of ritual impurity. So that's where they went wrong. They made a leap year. They added an extra month to give people a chance to become pure, which is not allowed. We don't add an extra month on this basis, only on other bases, to make sure the seasons are in the right time, to make sure that the lunar and solar cycles are somewhat in proximity, as was discussed much earlier in Kiddush HaChodesh. There was another difficulty that year. King Chizkiyahu made the year a leap year on the 30th day of Adar, which could have already been Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So we've learned in Kiddush HaChodesh that this, that they could add an extra Adar, is till the last day of Adar. But since this was already the 30th day of Adar, which is an extra day of Adar, that day may have already become the first day of Nisan, at which point it was potentially already too late. Instead, he made it the 30th of Adar. So it could have already been the first of Nisan. He said, no, let it still be the 30th day of Adar. And then, that way we still have a chance to add another month. But the sages didn't agree with King Chizkiah. Well, leap year should not be declared on the 30th day of Adar, as we explained earlier. Because of these two matters which were not done as prescribed by Jewish law, it was said they partook of the paschal sacrifice not in accordance with what was written. Chizkiah entreated for mercy for himself and for the sages who concurred with his actions. As Divrei Hayamim states, Chizkiah prayed for them, saying, may Hashem, who is good, atone for those. Hashem healed Chizkiyahu and healed the people, meaning the sacrifice was accepted. And now for the quiz.
Rabbi, just before we go to the quiz, a question.
Yes.
Earlier on, it stated that if the Kohen is impure, then the sacrifice is invalid. So I need to bring a sacrifice for whatever sin I've done. I hand it to the Kohen. He sacrifices it for me. I don't know he's impure. How does that solve my problem of obligation to bring a sacrifice?
So, firstly, if you're impure, then the Kohen would not be able to bring your sacrifice because he's ultimately your agent. But if he's impure, then also it means that he was a faulty agent. So that would be...
How do I solve that problem for myself?
You would have to bring another offering because the first one was invalid.
How do I know that?
Hopefully the Kohen would tell you. That's a good question.
Also, Rabbi, can I ask, whenever the offerings are made, is the Kohen Gadol required to be present?
I don't know if no, not by the offering. He just needs to have the tzitz on his forehead.
Sacrifice.
Although maybe what you're implying is, or let's say it like this. It's an interesting question. We said that the tzitz